All right, y'all, welcome back for lesson 2. We're just going to start getting warmed up here. So we're going to start by calculating our inverses using a table and a graph. So we have our function here, f of x equals 4x minus 1. So we're going to first fill out that table. So remembering our x goes in for x, so 4 times negative 2 minus 1. Negative 8 minus 1 gets us negative 9. And then we're going up by 4 every time. So negative 5, negative 1, 3. So we're going to graph that on this plane. So this is our regular function, negative 2, negative 9, negative 1, negative 5, 0, negative 1, and 1, 3. So that is our function. It's that line right there. So to find our inverse, just remembering, we're going to flip the coordinates of all of these. So instead of negative 2, negative 9, we're going to have negative 9, negative 2, negative 5, negative 1, negative 1, 0, and 3, 1. So let's make sure we can fit this all in there. So I'm going to graph that first one again real quick. Just give me a second. So that's our original line. And then our new one is negative 9, negative 2, negative 5, negative 1, negative 1, 0, and 3, 1. So that's our line we got going there. That's the inverse of the function. So just remembering it's reflecting, we're symmetric across that line. They're the opposites of each other. And just remembering how we calculate the inverse of that new graph. So the way we do that, we're going to use this today. It's the big idea. How we calculate the inverse is we have y equals 4x minus 1. We're going to switch y and x. So we have x equals 4y minus 1. Let's add 1 to both sides. And we're going to divide by 4. So we have x divided by 4. Remembering we're going to keep the x and the 4 together. And then also the 1 and the 4. There we go. So that's our inverse function. We're going to use that idea today for the rest of our lesson. We're going to do, what if it's not linear? We're going to explore that. So keeping in mind that an inverse function is the opposite, I want you to try to calculate these the best you can. So I know you can do the first one, so why don't you pause the video and do that, and try the second one while you're doing the first. If you don't get the first one, or the second one, we'll do it together as a class, so don't worry too much. So for the first one, I got x divided by negative 2 plus 5. Remembering negative 10 divided by negative 2 is a positive 5 equals y. For the second one, if you switched, we still switch x and y. All right? And then we got to get rid of that minus 2 first. So if your second step was to add 2 to both sides, x plus 2 equals the square root of y. That would be our first step there. Our next step is to think about what undoes the square root. What's the opposite? Well, the opposite of a square root is we're going to square both sides. So I'm going to write it over here on the left, and we get x plus 2 squared equals y. And I am okay if that's the answer you write. You do not need to Roddy Rich this thing and multiply it all out. Let's try another one. So here we have the function y equals 2x to the third minus 3. Pause the video and try to calculate that on your own. So here's what we have. Just remembering once you get to this spot, the opposite of the third power is the cube root. And so we just leave it like it is. You don't need to do anything with all the insides there and all that. You just leave it like it is. All right, so we're going to get into what happens if it's a quadratic. So we're going to look at the graph first. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to graph the function. And the function, if you can't read it, is y equals x squared minus 1. How do we graph something if we don't know? We make a table. So let's make a table because that's really useful for inverse functions. And we're going to go from -2 all the way to +2. So I want you to pause the video. You're going to put that in for x and then solve for y. So pause the video and try to make that table on your own. So here's what I got for my table. Just remembering when you put it in, you have to have parentheses. So let's graph our quadratic first. -2, 3, -1, 0, 0. Oh, it's right at that gap, huh? 1, 0, and 2, 3. So that's our quadratic function. But now we want to graph the inverse of it. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to calculate the inverse. So let's see. So we're going to do x equals y squared minus 1. So let's start by adding 1 to both sides. X plus 1 equals y squared. And here's the big important step you need to remember, is that when you square root something, square rooting undoes the squared. When we square root something, we have to have a positive and a negative. So we actually get two equations here. We get y equals the square root of x plus 1, and y equals the negative square root of x plus 1. So now we have to graph both of those equations. Now I know this was a long time ago in math too on how to graph square root functions. So our way to do it is we look inside. We look at x plus 1. What would make a 0 there? What number makes a 0? What x value? What number plus 1 is 0? So it's -1. So I'm just going to do the first table here. And that 0 tells us where to start our graph. And then we're going to count up by 1. So 0. And then you count up by 3. And this is just something I'm just telling you. And you don't need to know exactly why it makes sense, but that's just what we're going to do. And so here we're going to find the y value. -1 plus 1 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. This would be 1. 3 plus 1 is 4. The square root of 4 is 2. And so we're getting that. You can also, if you want, plus 5 would get us, let's see, 3 plus 5 is 8. Because 8 plus 1 gets us 9. The square root of 9 is 3. So we're graphing this function here. -1, 0, 0, 1, 3, 2, 8, 3. So you can see that that's only half of the inverse. That's why we also need this negative here. So if we do the negative, we're going to use the same x values. -1, oops, not -0, -1, 0, 3, and 8. And it just flips the sign. So 0 is still 0, but we get -1, -2, -3. So in this case, it kept it all the same, but just made it negative. So that is our inverse. So there we're actually getting two different functions. that make up the inverse. So we can get both of that whole curve. So let's try that now. I want you to calculate the inverse of this function. And then also graph both of them. So pause the video and try to let's just start with calculating the inverse of that function. Pause the video and see if you can do that, and then unpause and check your answers with mine. All right, so here's what I got. A couple mistakes to check for is when we square rooted, we made two equations. Important thing number one. Important thing number two, once you added one to both sides, the plus one is outside the square root there. Okay, it's outside the square root part. It's outside the square root part. So it doesn't combine with that negative one. So now you can get to graphing. I want you to make a table for this one, make a table for both of these. And for both of these, your table is going to start at what number minus 1 is 0? Starts at 1. So try to graph those, and we can check our answers in a second. All right, so I got the graphs over here. This is what your quadratic is going to look like. And then we have our positive square root here and our negative square root down there. So your homework for tonight is to graph and calculate the inverse of this function right here, x plus 3 squared minus 5. So once you're done, take a picture, submit it, and you're done for lesson 2 for the week.